Oh, is there anything in my teeth?
And you can put that in your intro.
Probably, now that I've done it. Hi Bartonella buddies! If you're new to my channel, my name is Jake, and in this video, I'm going to go over everything you need to know about testing for mast cell activation syndrome. Before we get into it, I would really appreciate it if you would consider subscribing before the end of this video, because that's one of the best ways to show support for my channel. And another good way to support my channel is to shop my Bartonella Babe merch, and I'll put a link to that in the video description box, and 25% of the proceeds go to supporting Bartonella research. In my previous video on how I was diagnosed with MCAS, I talked about how easy it is to get bogged down in different diagnostic criteria that different doctors use, Okay, how am I supposed to work if you're doing this? Come here, just for right now. Say hi! I'm the cutest and the smelliest dog in the world. In my previous video on MCAS, I talked about how easy it is to get bogged down in the different diagnostic criteria that different doctors use, different questionnaires that they use, and how many mast cells in the GI tract is clinically relevant. When testing for MCAS, it's easy to get bogged down in making sure you are getting the right tests, but also that you are handling the specimens meticulously, and then you have to make sure that the lab is handling the specimens meticulously at every step of the way. Testing for MCAS involves testing for what are called mast cell mediators, which are biochemicals that are released from mast cells when they freak out. Dr. Afrin used to like to say that there are over 200 mast cell mediators that are released by mast cells, but he switched over to saying there are over 1,000. Currently, we're only able to test for a handful of them, or 2 handfuls depending on how big your hands are. What further complicates testing is the fact that many of these biochemical mediators have short half-lives both inside and outside the body, and many of them are thermolabile, which means that they are sensitive to heat and have to be handled meticulously. According to Dr. Afrin, some of these mediators can degrade in literally 1 minute, so that sucks. What was I gonna say? Oh, that can produce a false negative. Also, some tests require that patients be off certain medications in order for the test to be accurate. However, this isn't always possible because some patients need their meds to drink water, eat, or prevent life-threatening anaphylaxis. So I will indicate which tests require med extensions as well, but fair warning, I'm not a doctor, so I may get some of this wrong, so if I do, please leave that in the comments and hashtag this is not medical advice, so don't stop any medications without speaking with your doctor prior. Let's start with tryptase. Tryptase is considered by some mast cell experts to be the most specific mast cell mediator and therefore best mediator that we can test for, because the vast majority of tryptase is released by mast cells as opposed to other types of cells, and it's the most abundant mediator in mast cells. Tryptase is measured via serum. In order to properly test for tryptase, it is recommended that patients get a baseline tryptase when they are not in a flare. It is then recommended that they get a lab slip from a doctor that they can take to a lab when they are in a flare. And by during a flare, I mean within 4 hours of an acute reaction or an anaphylactic episode. I've never gone into anaphylaxis, but I'm not sure why you'd want to go to a lab when you're having anaphylaxis. There are at least 2 different diagnostic criteria for diagnosing MCAS. One is proposed by Valent and colleagues, and the other is proposed by Afrin and colleagues. The Valent criteria is more conservative in diagnosing MCAS than the Afrin criteria. The Valent and colleagues camp criticize some of the mediators that I'll talk about in this video as not being specific enough to MCAS or not being validated as markers of MCAS. The Valent camp also places a lot of emphasis on anaphylaxis or severe reactions, and not all MCAS patients go into anaphylaxis, and MCAS patients can have really painful reactions and symptoms that aren't technically considered severe by doctors and researchers. It is my personal opinion that the Valent criteria are too conservative, which may leave the patient without proper diagnosis and treatment. Diagnostic criteria set by the Valent and colleagues camp use the following formula to determine if the flare tryptase is high enough to be indicative of MCAS. So let's say your baseline tryptase is 5 ng per ml. The formula looks like this. Your baseline tryptase, which is 5, plus 2, plus 20% of your baseline tryptase, which 20% of 5 is 1. So 5 plus 2 plus 1 is 8. You can call me Bartonella Babe, but you can also call me Math Maven. I once had a math teacher, and obviously my name's Jake, and there was another boy in the class, and his name was Jake, and the math teacher called me Worst Jake for the entire year. Or they called me Hannah Montana. And if you're wondering why they called me Hannah Montana, it's because my hair looks like this.
It did.
Hannah Montana, Hannah Montana, Hannah Montana, Hannah Montana, Hannah Montana, Hannah Montana.
That song is a work of musical genius. So to be positive, according to this formula, if your baseline tryptase was 5, your flared tryptase needs to be 8 or higher. See how easy it is to get bogged down? Let's get bogged down some more, shall we? According to Dr. Afrin and Dr. Dempsey, in their clinical experience, tryptase is not a reliable marker for mast cell activation. They have even seen some patients' levels of tryptase decrease below baseline during a severe or anaphylactic episode. They also make the argument that many mast cell patients are never truly in an asymptomatic state, so if your baseline is already elevated, what constitute a statistically significant rise in tryptase? So they say that in patients that they suspect of having MCAS, they're almost always able to find another mast cell mediator elevated in these patients. Tryptase is a good marker for mastocytosis, but I'm not going to go into that in this video, but I'll leave a link to that in the video description box. I've never had my tryptase measured when I was in a flare, and I'm glad I haven't, because adding the stress of going to a lab after I've had a big and usually very painful reaction sounds like cruel and unusual punishment, which goes against the 8th Amendment to our Constitution. So let's move beyond tryptase. Heparin is thought to be released only, or at least mainly, by mast cells, so it is a specific marker. Heparin is measured via plasma, and it has a very short half-life even when refrigerated. This means that not only does the blood have to be immediately chilled after doing the draw, but it also has to be refrigerated during centrifugation, and that centrifugation has to happen within 30 minutes of doing the blood draw. I have not had heparin tested specifically, but just to give you an example of how meticulous a lab has to be, I've had mast cell mediator testing done where the lab technician held an ice pack around the tube as my blood was filling up the tube. The problem with testing for heparin is that most laboratories' assays are not sensitive enough to detect the levels in mast cell patients, and that's because heparin tests were developed to detect the levels of heparin in patients that are undergoing heparin therapy, which are levels that are a lot higher than mast cell patients and healthy patients. So currently, these tests are mostly done in research settings. I have heard that if you get diagnostic workup done by Afrin, he can get this done for you at the University of Medicine and Dentistry, New Jersey, Rutgers Hospital Laboratory. I don't know where else this type of test is done, and if you really want to pursue it, it's possible that your doctor could email Dr. Afrin and he might know where else to get this done. Now on to chromogranin A. Chromogranin A is a mast cell mediator that has been found to be high in patients with MCAS. Chromogranin A is measured via serum, and the pros about this test is that it doesn't seem to be particularly thermolabile, so that means you don't have to worry about the lab doing everything perfectly at every step of the way. However, some researchers criticize chromogranin A as a mediator for MCAS because it is also released by other types of cells. Also, high levels of chromogranin A can indicate when a tumor is present, heart failure, and kidney failure. But perhaps one of the biggest issues with measuring chromogranin A is that proton pump inhibitors, or PPIs, can increase your levels drastically, and a lot of MCAS patients or patients suspected of having MCAS are on PPIs. Also, according to Dr. Molderings, H2 blockers may increase levels of chromogranin A as well, and I know this because he emailed me back, and he called me Mr. Picker. However, Afrin argues in the absence of those conditions that I just listed, and in the absence of PPI usage, chromogranin A could be a good indicator of MCAS. Lisa Klimas, a patient with mastocytosis and a scientist and the creator of a fantastic website called Mast Attack, and I think that's how you say her last name, Klimas. She is of the opinion that chromogranin A can be from too many other conditions for it to be a useful diagnostic indicator of MCAS, or at least that was her opinion when she wrote her blog post in 2017. If you want my opinion on it, if your insurance is going to cover the test and you're also not on PPIs, then it is a test worth pursuing. Afrin recommends that patients be off PPIs for at least 5 days in order to obtain an accurate result. Our next mediator is prostaglandin D2, aka PGD2, and this mediator can be measured in plasma and also a 24-hour urine sample. This mediator has a very short half-life and is extremely thermolabile, so it's pretty difficult to get an accurate result. If one can obtain a positive PGD2 test, it's usually a good indicator of mast cell activation because the vast majority of prostaglandin D2 is released by mast cells, while other cells release it, but only in minute amounts. NSAIDs like ibuprofen or aspirin interfere with the production of prostaglandins, which can contribute to a false negative. This is why it's advised that patients stop all NSAIDs, including topical NSAIDs, for at least 5 days prior to testing for prostaglandins, whether that be in the urine or the blood. I've had my plasma prostaglandins tested twice. The first time was through this feckless lab that wasn't doing anything right, and my result was actually below the normal range. And I'll correct myself in the editing process if I'm wrong about that, but I think I did hear Dr. Afrin say that if you have all of your mediators come back and they were below the normal range, then you know that the lab is not doing it right. The second time was tested through a different lab, and I had elevated levels, and this has been my only positive mast cell mediator test. In a study by Afrin and colleagues, 46% of mast cell patients were found to have elevated plasma PGD2 levels, while in another study by Afrin and colleagues, the number was 13%. So you can tell that there's a wide spread there. Prostaglandin D2 is broken down into its metabolite, and I will let Dr. Afrin say the name for us.
There's a metabolite of prostaglandin D2. It's got a long name. You're going to love this. 2,3-dinor 11-beta prostaglandin F2 alpha. And oh boy, do I wish there were a shorter name for that.
Boy. Yeah.
How Dr. Afrin was the oh boy. The only thing more Dr. Afrin than that is run-on sentences that are literally 2 paragraphs. This metabolite is more stable and can be measured in both blood and a 24-hour urine sample. However, it may be less specific to mast cells than PGD2 is. During the urine test, the patient is given a jug or 2 if you drink a lot of water like me, and you're asked to collect all of your urine within a 24-hour period. On the day that you start your test, you void the first urine of the day into the toilet and not the jug, and you write that timestamp on the jug at the oh my god, as the start of the test. You then collect every voiding of urine within the next 24 hours, including the next morning before that beginning timestamp. Obviously, this test is most easily done when the patient is at home for a 24-hour period, which, you know, wasn't a problem for me. Since all of the mediators for urine tests are extremely thermolabile, these are the recommended steps to ensure the accuracy of the test. Make sure you transport the urine to the refrigerated jug as soon as possible. So this means that if you have to poop, ideally you would pee and then put the urine in the jug and then poop after that if you're that talented. Number 2, it is recommended that you put the jug in the refrigerator the night before you do the test so that the jug is already cold. Number 3, Afrin recommends that you put the urine that's in the receptacle in a smaller container in the refrigerator and not add it to the jug immediately because you want it to cool first so that you're not repeatedly warming up all the urine in the jug. In my personal opinion, it seems like it would make sense to also refrigerate the receptacle in the refrigerator the night before and keep the receptacle refrigerated when you're not using it. I made this up, but I can't see how it could hurt and I can only see how it could help. 4, transport the urine to the lab right after you complete the last collection. The jug should stay in the refrigerator until you are ready to leave. You should then put the jug in a big Ziploc bag with ice in it, and you should put that in a cooler with ice in it, and then you should take the cooler with you to the lab. Do not take the jug out of the bag. If the lab technician has to take the jug out of the bag to scan it, that's fine, but then the jug needs to be immediately put in the refrigerator. Unfortunately, after this step, there's nothing more that you can do to ensure that the lab is doing everything right. They probably have to send it to a reference laboratory, and it has to be continuously chilled until it gets there. And if it has to go out of state, for example, then the specimen needs to be frozen. So good luck. Since these tests can be such a pain in the ass, not to mention anxiety provoking, I highly recommend that you do your due diligence, making sure that the lab has their shit together before you go through all of this. So don't just implicitly trust the lab or your doctor. Take charge. I also recommend that you go on Facebook MCAS support groups because you may be able to make a post there asking for lab recommendations in your area from veteran patients who have been through this process, and they might be able to recommend a lab that gets it. I don't want no scum. I don't want no scrub. Scrub is a guy who can't get no love from me. Hanging out the passenger side of his best friend's ride, trying to holler at me. Where is my record deal, okay? Histamine is the next mediator, so it can be tested in both blood and urine. It's considered less specific to mast cells because it is also released by basophils. When histamine is tested in the blood, it's tested in the plasma, and when it's tested in the urine, they look for the metabolite called N-methylhistamine. Histamine has a very short half-life inside the body, and it is less thermolabile than some of the other mediators, but since it often has to be transported 40 hours to a reference laboratory, it needs to be meticulously cared for. So there is some debate as to whether antihistamines, including H1 blockers like Zyrtec or H2 blockers like Pepcid, affect the outcomes of these tests. According to Dr. Afrin, he is not aware of any research that shows that antihistamines affect how dry someone's mouth is. Just kidding, they totally do. According to Dr. Afrin, he's not aware of any studies proving that antihistamine affects the outcome of these tests, including histamine tests. And if you think about how antihistamines work, they don't block the production of histamine. They actually block the binding at the H1 or H2 receptor on the outside of cells. And when Dr. Afrin publishes these papers, he doesn't necessarily have the patients go off their antihistamines. So when he tests their plasma histamine, anywhere from 29 to 49% test positive. When he tests the 24-hour N-methylhistamine, anywhere from 5 to 11% test positive. Furthermore, some people like me need moderate to high doses of antihistamines to eat, drink water, manage pain, and not die. However, in a study by Molderings and colleagues, 257 mast cell patients were tested for mast cell mediators, and they were on no mast cell medications whatsoever, and 22% tested positive for urinary N-methylhistamine 24-hour catch, as opposed to 5 to 11% in a couple of Dr. Afrin studies. I'm not saying that being off antihistamines will double your chances of getting a positive histamine test. What I am saying is that I think it's possible that antihistamines may interfere with MCAS testing because they may bring down the overall reactivity of the mast cells, and that could contribute to a less amount of histamine being released and or other mediators. Why do I think that? Well, let's quote Dr. Afrin himself. There are histamine receptors on a wide variety of cells in the human body, including actually the mast cells. So that's right, the mast cells produce histamine, they release histamine, and histamine can loop back and dock on the histamine receptors on the surface of the mast cell to further activate the mast cell. So, using his own logic, doesn't it make sense that antihistamines could reduce the levels of histamine produced by mast cells? Especially because when you take an H1 blocker, you're not blocking the H1 receptor on every single cell in your body. Dr. Afrin says we don't have any data proving that being on antihistamines confound the outcomes of these tests, but as far as I can tell, we don't have any data that prove that it doesn't. So if you can find that, please send it to me. It must be noted that diet, such as a low histamine diet, might also affect the results of these tests, as well as using the enzyme called diamine oxidase that breaks down histamine. For a long time, this question about stopping antihistamines for mast cell tests drove me absolutely insane because there was conflicting information, but now that I'm older and wiser, I've realized that it doesn't freaking matter. Because if you have to be on certain medications to eat, drink water, etc., then you don't stop those medications for the tests. And if you don't have to be on those medications, then that's a case-by-case thing that you decide with your doctor. The last mediator we'll be talking about today are called leukotrienes, and leukotrienes are released by a wide array of cells, so they're not specific to mast cells. The most common test we have for leukotrienes in the United States as of the filming of this video is a 24-hour urine catch, and it tests for leukotriene E4. Other leukotrienes may be tested, but they're mostly done in research settings. In a study of 198 patients evaluated by Dr. Afrin, around 8% were positive for urinary leukotriene E4. And to get bogged down even more, let's talk about the types of medications that may or may not influence this test. They're called leukotriene modifiers, and there are two different kinds. So one type is similar to an H1 blocker in that it blocks at the leukotriene receptor site, and the drugs that do this, one is called montelukast and the other is called zafirlukast. The other type of medication blocks the synthesis of leukotrienes, just like NSAIDs block the synthesis of prostaglandins. This medication is called Xylutin. My opinion on stopping these types of medications for MCAS testing is the same opinion that I have for stopping antihistamines. If you can, then maybe do it, and if you can't, then don't. Don't drive yourself crazy about this like I did. At this point, some people might say thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I'm gonna say thank you for listening to my tome. The best way to support my channel and my work is by giving this video a thumbs up, hitting that subscribe button if you haven't already, and shopping my Bartonella Babe merch. And here are my social media handles to stay the most up to date with my health journey. Piper says, "Hey sissy, can you do your best imitation of Dr. Afrin?" I can try. As I always say, you have to be patient, persistent, and systematic, and oh boy, will it pay off. Bye, Bartonella buddies! And oh boy, my voice cracked.